Good. Well, welcome to everybody. Thanks for coming out for the Monday night, March 19th, 2018 meeting of the Falls Church City Council and School Board as well. So we're delighted you're all here with us this evening. Mr. Webb, do you have anything you want to say before we get started?
Just looking forward to the continued work that we've got started with on Town Hall on yesterday, and continue answering questions that you all have and move forward.
Sounds good. And I tell you, before we get started, I would like to thank the folks who organized that wonderful Women's March yesterday. That was extremely well attended. Vice Mayor Connolly, Letty Hardy, and other folks at the table. You did a great job in organizing it, and the event I thought was just wonderful part of our city. So congratulations. Thank you. Mr. Shields, Dr. Noonan, why don't we send it on over to you all? Do you have any introductory remarks?
Well, thank you. I think maybe I'll just make a quick note about the agenda for this evening, just so we kind of understand the rules of, or the schedule. What is intended is first to have a discussion between the City Council and the School Board on the proposed school budget. And then from there, we have a staff report on the 3 ordinances the council will be asked to take first reading on next week. And that includes the budget ordinance, the tax rate ordinance, and the CIP. We'll have an update in our presentation on WMATA funding and on the debt issuance that's scheduled for May. We're intending to bring to council a bond resolution, not next week, but in 3 weeks for council action to authorize the issuance of bonds for a host of things, including the architecture and engineering for the schools. And then following those items, then we'll move from the budget then to the council work plan for the follow-up work session on that. And in that work plan, we've tried to tie it to some of the funding issues, what is funded, what is not funding, what is sort of maybe cautionarily funded or funded with some extra footnotes in the work plan, or items that are in the work plan that are partially funded in the budget. So with that overview of the agenda, then I'll turn it over to Dr. Noonan for responses to questions that were presented a week ago.
Thank you, Mr. City Manager. Good evening, Mr. Mayor, members of the council, school board chair, school board, staff. Very pleased to be here this evening to share with you some information that we gleaned from the presentation the other night. What we're going to send around is a hard copy of a budget questions and answer document that we have put together for this evening. As it's coming around, a couple things just to kind of set the stage. One is I wanted just to say to those of you that were at the meeting yesterday, I thought the presentation by the city manager was excellent. I thought the conversation was really great, and the questions that the community brought forward were really excellent as well. I think it was a good opportunity for us to share some information about the school budget additionally, and lay out kind of what our thinking was with respect to the budget process for those folks that may not have been at the presentation when the chair did his presentation for the council. That I understand will be up on the web within the next day or so, so anyone who wants to observe that certainly can. What this document that you have in front of you contains is the best of our recollection as we went through the budget questions that were raised the other night during the council meeting. You'll note as you open up the budget questions and answers that there's a table of contents, and the table of contents now is expressing 29 budget questions that have come forward. This table of contents identifies what were the topics of each of those budget questions, and primarily those have come from the board to date. But this evening, starting with budget question number 22, you will see these questions from 22 on to 29 tonight are questions that came out from the City Council at your meeting the other night. So what we thought we could do is sort of dive right in, go through these budget questions with you, and then answer any other further questions that you may have. So with that, we will start with number 22, question 22. And it was asking us to provide a comparison of our proposed salary increases with surrounding jurisdictions. Just as a reminder for those who may not have heard, we are recommending a salary increase of 3%. for our employees, and that's not just teacher compensation, that is overall compensation increase for all of our employees. And you'll note Arlington County is currently offering a 2.5% step increase. Alexandria is offering a 2.5% increase, and they're also and they're doing that by adding a step to their salary scale. Fairfax County is offering a 2.5% step, plus they're also offering 3% additional infusing 3% additional into their salary scale for all employees for a 5.5% salary scale enhancement. Loudoun County is offering a step of 2.2%. A COLA for non-teachers, so that is support staff and the like, would be getting a 1.3% COLA. Everyone else would be getting a 3.2% COLA, increasing teacher pay by 5.4%. Manassas City is offering a 2% step, a 5.6% COLA for 7.6% total increase. Manassas City is offering a 3% additional compensation, and that's a base raise for all of their teachers. And then Prince William County is offering a 2.7% teacher increase. That gives you a sense of what the surrounding jurisdictions are doing. Question 23 is expenditures over time. The question was provide the expenditure breakdown over time, and what you will see is a pie chart expressing the FY19 pie that shows that 85.3% of our budget is in salary and benefits for staff. And at the bottom, you will see numbers looking at FY15, 16, 17, 18, and 19 as they break out comparatively. And you'll note, as you look across, those numbers have remained fairly steady. The total salaries and benefits from 2015 were 63%. And we are expecting it be 63% for salary and wages also. 22% for other benefits this coming year in FY19, 21% in 15, and other expenditures 16% in FY15 and 15% in FY19. So the salary and benefits costs have remained very constant throughout the last 4 fiscal years. Question 24 is the cost per pupil, and that is how does it compare to other jurisdictions. The information and data that you see in this bar chart is directly from the Washington Area Boards of Education Guide, the WABE Guide for 2018. Here you will see that our FY16 per pupil was 18,032, FY17 was 18,418, and FY18 was 18,219, and how that compares to other jurisdictions. Arlington is higher than we are, but something that is interesting about our cost per pupil that I want to share with you, just to give you some context. Since FY07 to FY19, our cost per pupil has increased. The local cost per pupil has increased by 4.7%. So in 12 years, there's been a 4.7% increase overall in the local cost per pupil, when the inflation rate from 07 to 17 is 18.1%. So we've been able to be very efficient in our cost per pupil, not letting it meet what the inflationary rate has been. So I just share that as further context about where we are with our cost per pupil. Question 25 is a salary comparison with Arlington. This was not done in color, so you'll have a little bit of a hard time sort of at a first glance looking at it. But what you'll see here is a cost comparison from the FY salaries for FCCPS with Arlington County. The difference is shown in a percentage, and a negative number indicates where our salaries are lower. So for example, if you look at years one, if you look at just step one masters, you will see that we have one employee on that step at step one, and we are 3.5% above in that first year, 1.9% above in the second year, 0.4% in the third year, and in the fourth year, when teachers start making decisions whether or not they want to stay in education, we know that from the research in years 3, 4, and 5. In years 4 and 5, we start to lose ground, and we begin to go negative. So that just gives you some information here about that. There was a question that came up the other night from the council in the presentation from the school board, asking about where we were with respect to Arlington, and what we can say with definitively is that with a 3% COLA in FY19, we would be within 1.5% of Arlington County's salary scale, which would be really great news for us. Without a 3% COLA, we would be at 4%, within 4%. So in order for us to maintain competitiveness with Arlington, that was part of the reason that we did the COLA as opposed to the step, so that we can continue to grow the salary scale. Budget question 16 was savings for reducing the COLA. Here you will see a 3% COLA costs us $1,059,546. 2.5% would be $882,955, which would be a savings of $176,591. And a reduction to a 2% COLA would be $706,364, resulting in a savings of $353,182. Question 27 was, what is the cost of the increase of the employer contribution to employee retirement savings plans from $5 to $20 per pay period? The last year, FCCPS contributed a match in employee retirement savings accounts was in FY10. Since FY11, there's been no match made, so that's not an employee benefit that the schools are currently offering. Question 28 was about teacher turnover. We've gone back and pulled every file from the teachers that left last year, and for 16, 15, and 14. And here you will see two different charts. The first chart shows the number of teachers who left our system for another Virginia school system, a career advancement, or a change in career. And those numbers are fairly consistent year over year. We had 9 teachers leave in 14, 15. We had 6 teachers leave in 16 and 10 and 17, representing in the neighborhood of about 3.5% across the board. The next chart shows the teachers that were moving but did not currently ask for the reason. In addition, we also see some of our teachers that are moving but didn't ask for those reasons. This chart shows those that are moving, but it excludes those teachers that were leaving for military relocation, retirement, or to stay at home with their children. And the reason that they were left out is because they wouldn't be leaving for a reason consistent with potentially salary or benefits. So you'll see in 14, 15, 16, and 17, it was 10, 5, 12, and 8 respectively, for a percentage of about 4%, call it a 4% turnover. And question 29 is about our unfunded budget requests. Here you'll see a list of those items that were considered and rejected as possibilities within our budget. We did have $1.370 million of requests that did go unfunded. But in addition to those that were on the list, we did peel off several budget requests that came that would not be part of the 3% transfer as it exists today. The 2.8% transfer as it exists today, that we were able to fund by moving some money around, finding some efficiencies and the like. Just for a point of clarification, you will see in the unfunded budget request, as an example, the first one is a 0.5 PYP coordinator at Mount Daniel Elementary, and if you go down, you'll see a 0.5 at Thomas Jefferson Elementary. We had originally, in our budget requests, had one person in each of those schools, one at Mount Daniel, one at Thomas Jefferson, but in our budget have identified that we can find some efficiencies and create one position, and it's a 0.5 at each. So that means that half a position in each of the schools would be unfunded. So with that, Mr. Mayor and Mr. Chair, I will end my comments and will certainly take any questions that you might have.
Thank you very much. We appreciate you all doing the research and all the good work that you do. Are there any questions? Sure, Mr. Lichtenhouse.
Thank you, Dr. Noonan. Related to question number 28, do we know what level those teachers are that we're relocating? I know it's somewhat unknown as to why in some cases, but are these first 2 or 3 year teachers, or are they a little more advanced?
Research nationally would suggest that it's within the first 5 years. We would have to go back and identify specifically what it was.
Okay. And then on 29, the unfunded budget request, I know there was some discussion, comments you guys have made in terms of you found a way to absorb some of these needs by reorganizing, restructuring. There have been a couple ways that you've described it. Does that include these?
It does not.
Okay, so these are not part of, we found a way to make it work?
Correct. What
Got
we've
it,
been
okay.
able to identify is about $660,000 in reallocation and realignment of funds by scrubbing every single line item to capture savings. So it's $2,500 here, $1,000 there. And from that, we've been able to, on our side, support a preschool clerical support person, an elementary PYP coordinator for half-time, a laptop cart at the middle school, a counselor, a math specialist at the high school, a career and technical education support, hybrid classroom support, and band instrument support, and then division-wide, a special education teacher, a special ed specialist, a LEAP teacher, increasing some per pupil allocations for materials specifically, and then looking at software licenses, bus supervisor, additional time, and some money for bus replacement.
Okay. But none of these on this list under question 29?
None of these are
were
funded.
included? Okay.
Ms. Hardy?
Are we doing questions all at the end, or just as each group presents Q&A? Just now, is it good for all the questions? Okay. Questions on the scales. Is that total compensation or just base pay?
Base pay.
Base pay.
And they
Does
have,
it look different when we look at total compensation?
it would look worse. Yeah, they
So we're
have
less
some
generous on
benefits.
benefits than-
Some things that Arlington does with respect to benefits that we don't do.
Yeah, so since we don't have the color version, I think I've seen the color version. I think, if I remember the numbers correctly, if we do the 3% COLA, we're going to be at 1.3% of APS's salary bands on average across all these. If we don't do the COLA, we're 4% behind. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. My question was also on page 39, so question 28, the teacher turnover, similar to Mr. Lakenhouse. So given that previous four-year plan to kind of improve teacher salaries, I think a big thing, this is probably even before my time, when the four-year plan started, was to work on teacher retention. And I think this probably predates the chart you have here, but do we know how retention rates, because it's the first time we're seeing retention rates, so I think it's great that we're actually putting this data on paper. How does, I guess, retention rates look ever since that plan was implemented? So we were really concerned about stemming attrition, and we were really concerned, frankly, because we lost a lot of really great talent and some really beloved teachers at the time. Some of them I knew as well. So I'm curious how our retention rates have improved or not improved ever since that salary plan was put in place.
Yeah, 16, it's the second year. So if we look at the most recent increases to teacher salary, we made significant investments in FY15 and FY16. And when you look at the chart of teacher retention, you can see that teacher retention really did decrease from 15 to 16, right? So perhaps that second year of teacher investments in pay really did help us reduce turnover in FY16.
But we didn't break it down and ask about, was this for teacher pay or was it for a better job or, other, I guess, drivers of job satisfaction is kind of what I'm getting at, right?
Yeah, we didn't. Most of these are really kind of the general reason. And in part, when you look at, many teachers leave for multiple reasons, right? It may be, pay combined with the cost of living and other components. But one of the things I know we need to improve on is really gathering better survey data when people leave, right, in terms of getting more specific. Because the answers really are pretty general in terms of, career advancement or moving, but not specific.
And I don't know whether, because I'm not in the schools, I don't know whether these are good rates, bad rates. Do we know how these compare to typical or averages in Virginia or even national averages?
We'd have to look. I would say at first blush, typically, retention rates, anything under 5% are pretty strong.
Okay.
All right, other questions?
Sorry,
I'm
I had
still
more.
going? Okay, keep
Is that
going.
okay? I'm only getting started. So last time we talked about, and the reason why I asked about some nitty-gritty questions is I think frankly we were really about $350,000 apart. I think the difference between that 2% and the 2.8%, right, is $350, so it's less than a penny on the tax rate. So I think every little bit counts. Last time I asked about the TJ Mount Daniel money, and the reason I harp on that is because I think one of my first budgets 2 years ago, I remember that we needed school buses for schools, and there was a discussion I had with then school board member Lawrence, I think. I don't know if it was you or it might have been John Lawrence. where we talked about why couldn't we bond and debt finance those buses? Why do we have to kind of take it and do it within school operating? And so likewise, I have kind of, the reverse of that is, I know that we have to pay for the TJ Mount Daniel playground with the daycare proceeds because there's a specific, I guess, I don't know if it's a legal opinion that says those monies need to be applied to, I guess, daycare beneficiaries. I guess I'd argue that there's other things in the schools that probably benefit daycare recipients, and if we can debt finance those two playgrounds, would that help free up some those monies for operating dollars? And do we have a legal opinion that says we really can't do that?
Sure. So when we look at the daycare funding, it's a special revenue fund. So the fees that we're charging in that program need to support the program's activities, very similar to the food service program, right? As we charge students lunch fees, we have to use that funding to support the program. But the funds can be used to pay wages, and they can also be used to fund equipment and other things. So we really gave a lot of thought in terms of the daycare program, in terms of what do they use and what could we potentially ask them to pay for. Right, so when we look at things like playgrounds are extensively used by daycare, we also considered other things, looking at the renovations at Mount Daniel, whether it's cafeteria tables or other components. But if we were to take that playground funding and fund that with bond funding, right, then we would need to use that daycare revenue to support the daycare program in some other way. And the operating fund, we're correct in that it is funding the school building, it does pay for the cafeteria tables and other components, but funding the playground equipment was really the best use that we could find of that funding. When we look at the playground equipment in general, it really is in dire need of repair, right? It's reaching the end of its useful life, it has cracks in the plastic and other components. So our thinking was really, if we weren't able to pay for that with daycare funding, we would need to be using other school funds, whether it's bond or other dollars, to replace it.
Yeah.
So at the
My
time, we
question
thought
is
that
less
was
about
best
the
use.
importance and whether we should do it. I'm, in agreement we should do something about it, but it's more using that money for something else, because that frees up operating dollars for something else, right? Like, it's just shifting the money around and wanting to make sure that we are really airtight and having to use that money there, because it feels like that's something that we should fund. But if there's an opportunity to, not that I want to add to our debt service, but if there's an opportunity to think about using debt financing for that, does that help with operating?
And we couldn't come up with any other potential operating costs that we could bill to daycare in its place. They already are paying us a cost in terms of their impact to utilities and other components, so we weren't able to identify another operating fund offset where we thought we could better use the money.
I mean, as long as we've gotten the legal opinion that says that's we've pushed it as much as we can, I'm comfortable with that. But again, I feel like it was something I thought it was worth exploring, given that we had that discussion a couple years ago about school buses.
Absolutely.
Going to, I don't think it was on this, but maybe it was in the presentation. We talked about those mid-market bands. I think one point of feedback and question I had is that we seem like we're concerned about losing people kind of mid-tenure. And that's where we actually have really valuable teachers, because we've invested in them earlier in the career and we'd hate to lose them 5 or 8 years in. I know that we talked about kind of the idea of making sure that we're consistent about giving 3% across the board, but have y'all given more thought on actually differentiating for those mid-market bands, knowing that that's where we're not going to be competitive? So we're really, if we ultimately care about retention, and we know that we're, say, 8 or 10% off from what the Arlington bands are in those areas, why not give, say, 2.5% across the board, and then in those specific bands, give 3.5%, just so we start closing those gaps a little more? Have y'all given more thought on that?
Sure. When we look at our salary scale overall, typically there's integrity to a salary scale. So one of the things are the distance between the steps are a set percentage. So certainly you could adjust that and you could change the salary increases. But we would also want to really think long-term about what the impact is to those step increases when we get to a point where we're restoring steps, right? So do we have, different increases? So if in a year we only funded steps, would we have some people who received a very small increase because we adjusted the steps by putting additional funding in them this year, right? So we want to think long-term about the integrity of our steps, because teachers typically would move up 1 step increase for each year of experience. So teacher salary scales are really a true step and grade system. So there's certainly that consideration.
I'll just acknowledge that I don't get the step versus
Sure.
changes. It's something I've tried really hard to understand for a few years now, and I still don't quite get it. But it's more of a general, philosophical question that if we
Well,
know.
philosophically, that, for the last 2 or 3 years, that's been happening. If you look back at who's been compensated where in the salary scale, they've gone to specific bands. And now they feel like, we feel like at least the distance between each step is appropriate, knowing that there is some sag in there. I think there are other ways to address sort of your question and your concern, not immediately, but over time, and that is potentially looking at how we might be able to collapse the scale a little bit and reduce the number of steps, reduce the number of grades, and look at how we might be able to bring that middle up. So those are some things that we are going to have a conversation about. But finishing up this this plan that has been in place for the last several years, they really did in the last 2 or 3 hit some of those most disproportionately low areas and brought those up.
Okay, because ultimately, I think we all have the same goal in mind, which is we want to pay our teachers as best as possible, given what we can afford. And I think if we, when you look at the numbers there, when you see that we're 11% behind, you want to make sure we are doing something more targeted. Going to the question that Mr. Lickenhouse also started around reallocation and realignment. So that was not related to question 29, page 40, right? Those are things that I think I saw from a previous presentation that we've found about $700,000 in savings to fund positions like the band equipment, the other positions, the PYP coordinators, and the list that you mentioned. Is that correct? Did I get that number correct?
It's about 650.
650, okay. So is that I know that net, we're only adding the psychologists, but gross, we're actually adding 6 or 7, right? Because even though you're funding those 6 or 7 with reallocations and
6 or 7.
gross positions.
I'd have to go back and exactly identify how many, but it's 1, 2, 3 positions plus the school psychologist, so it'd be 4.
Okay, so we funded most of them with efficiencies that we found,
Correct.
which I think is great, because I think it's something that city managers talked about doing on in the general government side, so I'm glad we're doing those. So more of a general question is, the one that we've talked most about is the psychologist and the COLA, but we have talked less about kind of the PYP coordinator, the other things that we funded with those reallocation dollars. Has the school board already done a scrub to kind of say that list that was funded through reallocation is a higher priority than the psychologist and the COLA, and that's why we've talked more broadly in the community about the psychologist and the COLA?
I won't speak specifically for the school board. I'll let them speak for themselves, but I will say if scrub means having lots of robust conversations and asking lots of questions of me, absolutely, they have. So, but I'll leave it to them to.
I think what we did this year was definitely the best route of going about it, that we have always been talking about going through our budget and looking for ways that we can potentially afford and do some of the things ourselves, and I think we did that to the best of our ability. And then with what we're asking for in the 2.8, really we're asking for 2 things. We're asking for the city to general government to fund the COLA, which ultimately continues to keep our salary for our teachers and employees in general within a certain percentage of Arlington, as well as competitive within the region. And the psychologists is just because we are picking up the bulk, you all are picking up the bulk of that, but we're picking up some of that also. But it's with the out of whack percentage of the ratios of the student to our psychologist, I think it's a must-need position that we ultimately looked at as one that we have to do this year. And within the way that we constructed our budget with picking up almost $700,000 of things from that, I thought that's putting that within the request that we were asking for general government to fund, I think was the best way to go about doing that. But it was through conversations with staff of all the buildings, as well as amongst the board members, this is how we thought was the best usage of the funds.
And I don't want to lose the other big point too, to add on to what Mr. Webb said, and that is that the school board adopted earlier this year their triennial plan, and that triennial plan really outlined very specifically what our outcomes are that we're seeking this year. And so when we went through the budget process and asked our staff to develop a plan with that triennial plan in mind, which had been adopted by the school board, none of these requests are outside of specifically what we're trying to accomplish within our strategic plan. So when you ask the question, was it more important? I would say all of these are equally important, and that was part of why we really felt like it was incumbent upon us to find ways to really realign what we were doing to fund as much as we possibly can to meet the needs of that triennial plan.
Yeah, and again, I think it's great that we found $650,000 in savings and we're able to fund those. I think phrased differently, my question is, could we use 650 to fund a psychologist and some of the COLA? And then we ask city council for the 2.8% to fund some of these other things, right? Like, I'm just curious what that prioritized list looked like, because we've mainly been hearing psychologists and COLA, very important, right? And I think as a parent, I certainly agree that those things are things I would love to do. But when you actually start digging down and saying, gosh, we've actually funded things like clerical support. And I have less visibility in the relative importance of these things. But I think I just would be interested in knowing, was there some trade-off already made that said, no, we really feel like that clerical support needed to go in there, or the special ed specialist, or the LEAP specialist, or the counselor,
I guess I don't see of how we are funding it, what's the big difference of whether we flip it from the 650 to the 2.8. I guess I don't see the major sticking point of switching how the monies were used, be it the 650 were used for those two positions and helping to fund the COLA versus the other part going towards that. So I guess I think
it's
not
more of a
understanding.
transparency question I have, because I think as we make tough decisions and figuring out how we can, on the general government side and the others, I think it's just, I want to make sure that if I have to do a trade-off between, neighborhood traffic calming versus psychologists, that's a really tough trade-off. And I think we just want to understand the details of where we might have added positions.
Can I ask a point of order question? I think it would be helpful, maybe just in the broader context. It's my understanding, in terms of the relationship between the city school board and the general government and city council, is that we're asking for a request of 2.8% transfer, which is a certain amount of money, and then that money's transferred, and what we purchase out of that money that's transferred is really sort of the school board's purview. Is that
Absolutely, and
correct?
again,
Yeah. Okay. I just wanted.
I know this is your prioritization list, but I think I just wanted more visibility into the new positions that we're adding. Because I think, again, most of what the community has heard about is the COLA and the psychologist. And I think after reading through the list of other things that we're funding, and again, I applaud the school board on actually finding those efficiencies, because I think it's great in general. And I'm going to have the same questions on the general government side on where we're finding efficiencies on HR and the community planning in EDO positions as well. I think there are some questions over here.
I think Vice Mayor Connolly would like to speak next.
My point was just similar to Dr. Noonan's, and that is that we're going to give them a number, the amount that they asked for, or the amount that we decide to give them. But in the end, it really is up to the school board to decide what they're going to do with that money. And I think we do need to respect all the work that they put into it so far. So I do appreciate what you've put into it. And I think to drill down so hard into the details of what the school board has done is getting to be a little extreme.
All right, other questions, comments? Mr. Duncan? Oh, I'm sorry.
No, I would just say that dollars are fungible, obviously. So, money is money. Money can be spent for any amount of things. As Dr. Noonan said, we're going to get a pot of money. And I think that even in the way our school board things were, like, the superintendent can actually use that money as he sees fit. So it may be the point where we're going about things and the budget changes and we really need two psychologists, as an example. But I would echo Ms. Connolly's point that the city council doesn't have line item discretion over our budget. So how we choose to spend that money is in our discretion based on what we think is best for the schools. And I really appreciate your questions, but I think that it is a bit overreaching in terms of what city council can ask of our budget.
It's a transparency question, because again,
We've been very transparent about what we plan to spend the money on. That's never been a secret. It's always been laid out. It's been laid out from the very beginning. The fact that we've worked really hard to find efficiencies to fund that budget, I think is really commendable to our staff and Dr. Noonan. They've worked extraordinarily hard. They could have just said, listen, we need 5%, and not work to find the extra money. So again, while I appreciate the questions, I do think that it is, kind of questioning the work that we've done, and we have put out there, there's not a secret that we're trying to fund a lot of different things.
Nice to see some other folks sparring over the budget besides me. I just want to observe that and let other people keep talking.
You're next, right?
So I was just going to comment that, with regard to transparency, I think that the positions that we've added have been extremely transparent from the very beginning. I think every single presentation that Dr. Noonan has given has listed out the positions that we want to add, to the point where I think, especially the people who've been coming to the meetings and the PTA presidents can pretty much recite, special education, that, so on and so forth. So I think that you know, there has been a lot of publication, and maybe, you know, a nice soundbite is the psychologist and the 3% COLA, but any presentation that Dr. Noonan has given has clearly included all those different positions that we're looking at.
How about Mr. Snyder, and then we'll go around the table. Mr. Castillo, do you want to go?
We had our side.
All right.
Thank you, Mayor. I'm not going to drill down, but I do want to ask a few questions with regard to some things that I think are of concern to the citizens here. First of all, with regard to the proposed budget, what impact does this have on our class sizes? As I know it's imperfect art, but do you see maintaining the same level, or is there more risk involved in keeping that?
Currently, our request, if funded, wouldn't have any impact on the class sizes.
And can you contrast our class sizes against what Arlington spends for their teachers per student? Is there any comparison there? Is it like asking you what's the difference between apples and starfish?
It's not exactly apples and starfish. It's probably better if I send it to you, but it is published in the Wehby Guide. And the average class size in elementary school, and this does not, I'm making sure I get this right, it's per class, including, and this is teachers only, our class size is 22.9 students. This is where it gets a little fuzzy how it's reported. Arlington's class size is 21.3, so we are slightly above what Arlington is across the system, and that's at the elementary. At the middle, ours is 23.5, Arlington's 22.1, and in high school we're 20.1, and Arlington is 19.6. So in all three categories, we are above classes. Numbers of students per class, according to the Wehby Guide.
Thank you. I think that's a telling metric. I have two more questions here. The first one is, the second one is with regard to professional development. And so if you could just give me some general context here. I see that as being training opportunities. I presume you have some advanced degree stipends. Maybe there's some off-site training or special kinds of training that you do that's made available to your teaching population. I'm not going to ask you how you parse that out, but is that included in the benefits area, or is that some other kind of different pool?
It's captured in our professional development area, and also through the Ed Foundation. They also support some professional development as well. I consider it an employee benefit, however, and I think it's really important for a recruiting tool for us to be able to go out and talk with those teachers that we are bringing in about the opportunities to go to conferences, to be able to learn from each other, and to also say if you want to advance your degree and you want to support growth, because we're a learning organization and we want our teachers learning right along with kids, that we are going to support that. I think that, by the way, is a really interesting point, and I don't want to get into too deep of an analysis at the table, but when you look at where the greatest discrepancies are in comparison with Arlington, and we see specifically at the BA plus 15, the final steps, that's where the salary scale has the greatest lag. We really don't want our teachers to stay there. We want them to move on and get more education. And so one of the ways to support people moving forward in their own education is to potentially not make it detrimental, but not pay them as well as people that are trying to increase their advantage in the marketplace with getting better at what they do and honing their craft.
Well, that's a very good answer. And I would then take from the way you answered the question that it's merit-based and not just some automatic percentage that's spread out across the board. And then part of that is how does that compare to Arlington as well?
Yeah, we are a step and grade system. We're not a merit-based system. However, if a teacher is struggling and having some concern, there are ways that we can hold steps and hold grades if necessary.
And how does this professional development compare to Arlington?
I can't say that for sure because I don't know exactly what theirs is.
Okay. And the last question I have here is with regard to, and I guess it gets asked every year, there's probably some amount of unallocated funds, balance contingency, holdback, things you look at for savings. And so my question really goes to not what the amount is, even though if you want to share that amount, that's fine. But how does this compare in the proposed budget to where we were in the previous years? Of course, how do we use that amount? Not all of it was, I'm sure, well spent or well retained.
Yeah, as I look at the amount of money in fund balance over the last several years, it does range. The amount that's being allocated for use in the FY19 budget has been fairly consistent, is consistent with what has been used previously.
Okay, thank you very much.
Dr. Noonan, well, just a couple of clarifying points. First of all, I think it might be good to distribute the WABE guide to our colleagues on City Council. It's got a lot of good information that you can go through and do all kinds of comparisons, and it's got good context, overhead, admin rates, class size, all that stuff. One question I would have is, with respect to the salary increase, the COLA, it's not just a question about retention, it's also a question about when you're hiring candidates, not losing a good candidate to another division. So it's not just retention where you're measuring things like that, it's also, are we getting the candidates that we really want? And in the past, we were losing some of those. So I think that's an important context there, and that's where, you know, as you move going forward, if those gaps reappear, that will be another symptom of issues with respect to salary parity. Dr. Noonan, I was wondering if you could also talk a little bit about where administrative compensation is relative to the market and the gaps there. And I'm not sure if your answer in your discussion captured that.
Yeah, I could speak specifically about when you say administrative principals and assistant
Correct.
principals. And in both of those categories, I think we have some significant work to do with creating some parity with the surrounding jurisdictions. Our assistant principals are in some cases 10 to 15% below their counterparts in surrounding jurisdictions because they have not been taken care of as well as our teaching force has.
Okay, thank you.
But a 3% COLA would hit the principals also.
Well, thank you very much. So thank you for the work that you've done, certainly our colleagues on the school board and everyone involved in the school community. So I'm going to run through some questions, and the reason for why I'm asking these questions is because the only way that we can set on a number other than to set it purely politically is to understand what the schools are spending and why. And so please understand the questions are simply intended to do our job to the extent that we can. And as we all know, school boards have been very patient with us in the past when we've answered this kind of question, when we asked questions, and we assume that would continue. So there are those who say we should keep the school allocation increase to 2%. What if we did that? What would be the impact?
There really are three ways that we would consider dealing with that gap, and it would require a lot more conversation with the community and with our school board. One would be by reducing the COLA to 2.3%, eliminating 4 teaching positions across the system, or looking at those other, as Ms. Hardy suggested, looking at the other things that we've been able to find efficiencies to create and not fund. So things like a special education specialist, clerical support at Jesse Thackeray, the PYP coordinator at Mount Daniel, Thomas Jefferson, and not funding a psychologist.
So let me ask, because obviously in this day and age, the mental health of students and professionals that are concerned with it are first and foremost in our minds. What's the ratio of counselors to students in the school system?
Counselors or psychologists?
I'm going to start with counselors first.
Okay, counselors were 1 to 250 students
1 to 250, okay.
across the division.
Right.
There's some issue still at, we need to resolve at Mary Ellen Henderson.
And psychologists are what? You said 1 to what, 1,200 or something like that?
13.
Now, do those psychologists do special ed or do they do mental health?
They do a little of both. They do some mental health, and they also do educational testing.
Okay. And how does that compare with Arlington, for example, in terms of if you took the counselors per student and the psychologists per student, how do we compare with Arlington?
I'd have to go back and get you the Arlington number for school counselors. I think we shared yesterday in the presentation what it looked like comparatively to Arlington is, yeah, they're working to get to 1 to 775.
Arlington,
Yes,
psychologists,
yes.
1 to how much?
Currently at 868.
868, okay. And counselors, they're at, what'd you say, 1 to 250 or something like that?
I don't know. Counselors, I'd have to get that.
Yeah, if you could get that information, because I think we want to make sure that we're adequately funding whatever the schools need, not only in terms of instruction, but in terms of mental health resources. So there are those who suggest, well, we're spending $120 million for a new high school. Why can't the schools agree to a diet? And the city council suggested that should be 2% this year. The schools have come back and said, we really feel that for one reason or another, we can't do that. So why aren't you willing to settle for something in the range of 2% over the next 3 or foreseeable years?
I think there's multiple prongs to that answer, and I suppose my first answer would be we've come in with the lowest percentage of request in the last 5 years. If it was just the school's operating fund and just the general government's operating fund, we actually contribute to a 3% decrease in the tax rate. So the thought of us coming forward and asking for more money is a little bit surprising to me, because we actually are resulting our two budgets together, the city manager's and mine, in a decrease in the operating budget. 2% guidance doesn't give us enough money to give a 3% COLA to our staff if we did nothing else. The city manager and I spoke earlier this year, and we both agreed that we were going to come out together to give 3%. And so we're looking for enough money from the general government, city council, to be able to pay for 3% COLA.
Next question. You said you have a triennial budget plan. Which 3 years are we talking about? This year and 2 years out?
It's a triennial plan that includes budget, also includes educational programming and the like. Yes, it's this year, 19 and 20.
So what should we expect in FY 19 and 20 then?
It depends on growth, Mr. Snyder, more than anything. If we continue to have more students come and join us, then we may need more teachers. So it's hard to say exactly what the needs are going to be this time next year.
Do we have a growth in students from last year to this year?
We did. It was a small number. Actually, it was 8, but the year before it was 171, and the year before that it was 64. So over the last 3 years, the average has been over 70. And we are counting on less than 70 this coming year.
So one final question for this round. Consolidation with the city in terms of services, has that actively been looked at? Have you and the city manager had some discussions about, we're a small community and yet we seem to be maintaining 2 parallel systems within 2 square miles. So the question is, repeatedly occurs, what are we doing? Why don't, we've heard about economies of large scale, why aren't we getting economies of small scale? So let me throw that out to both of you.
Yeah, we've had a number of conversations regarding consolidation, and we'll continue having those conversations, because I think we've identified a couple of places that we'd like to potentially take a look at and dig deeper into. To paraphrase what the city manager said yesterday, which I think is 100% accurate, is that I think by consolidating, wherever we do consolidate, may not necessarily result in less people, but could result in better services. So if we're looking for cost savings, I'm not sure that they're there to find, but with respect to quality of service, it could have an impact.
Well, since
And
we're-
just as an example, we have one person that does accounts payable. We have one person that does accounts receivable. So by combining, he would still need my person to help with accounts receivable and my person to help with accounts payable because of the number of people that would be picked up and the number of bills, so.
I got that far in school, 1 + 1 = 2. Don't ask me to go any further than that. Anyway,
And
thank you.
I didn't mean to at all.
City manager, do you have a comment on that?
Well, I would just like to agree with Dr. Noonan's agreement with my statement.
We all agree 1 + 1 = 2, is that, yeah.
The areas that I think are worthy of study are a lot of these kind of back office or internal service functions.
Right.
These are important functions, but they tend to be serving the organization in the area of finance, human resources, IT. Those are the places naturally, if you look around the state where school boards and general government have shared services, those are the typical areas. There are things that we're currently doing, like fleet maintenance. We do that together. Some of our maintenance contracts for facilities we've done together. Some of our telecom we've tried to do together. Sometimes it works out well. Sometimes we choose to go our separate ways for valid reasons. But I think that's what I think the impulse is that we're receiving and we want to pursue is let's look into it with fresh eyes and kind of a new spirit.
I would ask that you do so. So thanks a lot. 2 final notes. First of all, I agree totally with Councilmember Z's question about class size. In my view, class size is absolutely fundamental. That's not something we want to lose our edge on. So finally, over the years, the schools have won various awards and have been nationally rated. But recently, we seem not to get the ratings we once did. So can you explain to me, if I were saying to someone outside of Falls Church has not experienced our schools, and they said, well, how do you rate according to this measure or that measure? Tell me what I should say to them about how we compare to other schools in terms of objective ratings.
Sure. Well, first of all, I would question the objectiveness of the ratings because I'm not sure that they're absolutely objective. For example, Niche, which seems to be a very popular one. If you look at Zillow, you'll see great schools in Niche. And what we've learned, and I know John Brett is here tonight, is that 50% of the quality points that you receive for Niche is based on how many people have logged in and hit your school site. So if people aren't going in and actually navigating to your school, you're not going to rate as highly as others. So that's one thing that we need to pay attention to. The other is Great Schools has a very similar algorithm. With respect to the indicators that may be more objective, and specifically I would talk about U.S. News and World Reports that come out. There was a recent rating that was given last year around Falls Church City Public Schools, and we did go down. And the reason that we went down was because International Baccalaureate did not give the data set for our schools to U.S. News and World Reports, unfortunately. We have worked with them. We, along with I think every other IB high school in the country, has worked with them and said you need to get the data to them. We have been asked for the data. We've given it, and we anticipate that we will be part of that U.S. News and World Reports, and we'll also be part of the Challenge Index that Jay Matthews does as well. So I would anticipate a bump this year because they have the data. But around great city schools and Niche, the only thing I can say to people is please go out and log in and hit our schools. And for every 100 website hits that you get, we probably go up 1 point. So that was, and not to be flip, but I do think that that's where this becomes not an objective exercise. It becomes extremely subjective and dependent on variables that really have nothing to do with the quality of education that happens in our building.
Thanks. And one final request. Could you get me the latest local composite index numbers, Falls Church versus Prince William, Loudon, schools like that? I think that's in that, used to be a yellow book I think you can get from the State Board of Education or whatever. If you could get that to me, because that's a constant source of aggravation, at least for me anyway.
We're still 0.8.
Yeah, no better.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you all very much for the answers.
Mr. Duncan?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So as I listen to you all, it occurs to me that the opportunity that we have with this budget, I think, is to engage the whole community in a conversation about our striving to meet the standard, the gold standard of Arlington. That is what I hear you all saying that you would like to do, and I think we need to have a serious conversation in Falls Church about what that means. Before I go into that in too much detail, though, I do want to thank you all for all the hard work you do. I know it is a lot of work. I remember when my kids first started going to the schools here, I would go to budget work sessions of the school board and was always very impressed with the amount of time and effort that was dedicated to, discussing a third of an FTE custodian in order to meet budget. And I'm sure you all apply that same amount of effort. And I'm sure you understand that, our job over here is to, model the kind of behavior that we know that you will follow when you're sitting on this side of the table someday and are responsible for setting the tax rate and looking after the needs of the whole community. You all are obviously in charge of meeting the needs of probably the most very important component of our community. At any rate, I just wanted to say that as a personal statement. Back to the race against Arlington. So some of you have been around here for a while. And remember when we started the salary progression plan with an effort to, close the gap with Arlington. My recollection is that at that point, we thought that if we could get within 4 or 5% of Arlington, that would be a good day's work, and we'd declare victory and, move on to other priorities such as capital needs. Now, maybe I'm not remembering it correctly, or maybe I am remembering it correctly, and we are now striving to meet a higher standard. If we are striving to meet a 1% standard, which is near parity, then let's just tell folks that in the community, and let's let them know that there's a cost associated with being just like Arlington. That will invite a conversation, I think, about other areas where we are not like Arlington through the lenses that we look at. The income standard that we set for helping folks with tax relief and abatement, Falls Church is less than $25,000. In Arlington, I think it's double that. Of course, the tax rate we know is around $1 in Arlington, and they seem pretty stubbornly attached to trying to stay there, to some degree at least, willing to adjust their class sizes up. I had read something about Arlington's budget process this time around, and the efforts they're making to adjust their class sizes because they have some of the same capital facilities challenges we do, and they do want to keep their tax rate about where it is apparently. And so, they were going to do some tinkering with class sizes. If that has any effect on the numbers, obviously, that you gave before, it would be useful for us to know that. So my question is, with those things in mind, there are clearly areas where we are very different from Arlington. We do not meet the needs of vulnerable populations here the way they do in Arlington. We do not have an affordable housing campaign, to speak of. We do not have a tax relief and abatement campaign that is, half as robust as theirs, and our tax rate is significantly higher. So what I'm asking is for just an impression of what you all have. Do you feel like if this plan that you put forth this year that gets us within 1% is something that we're going to keep to? We're going to keep to it every day, every year. Ms. Hardy, in her update that she sent last week, I'm sure some of you read it, said that when we talk about keeping up with Arlington, effort that is going to be challenging to accomplish, I think was the way that she put it. Do you all share that belief, or do you believe that at some point we're going to reach a steady state, and we're going to reach that steady state without having to do the kind of very intense development that at least I don't hear people in Falls Church calling for? So that's just a philosophical question, and it helps me inform, how I look at it. My impression of this budget is it's a really good budget. Compared to the ones I've seen in past years, the gap is a lot closer. $350,000 in my mind is a band that tells me that, the manager and the superintendent should go, we should lock them in a room together, and they should just work it out and tell us how it turned out in the end. But that doesn't seem to be the way that we, kind of go about it. So I would like, my impression, my answer to the question is I'd set the tax rate at about 4.75 and, tell them to figure out how to make up that $350,000. But I'd like to hear from you all. If you feel like we can really keep up with Arlington in these areas that you've identified, if the cost associated with that is something that we can bear going forward.
With your permission, I'll take that one on. Mr. Duncan, the goal has never been to exceed or even be at the same level in Arlington's compensation. The stated goal has always been within 3 to 5%, and we want to be competitive with Arlington, and we think we need to be competitive with Arlington. The point here, though, is it's not just about the scales. It's about how much you pay your teachers, and that includes steps and the amount of the scale. And we think we need to increase teacher compensation so that it is fair. And so when you looked at the table that Dr. Noonan went through, you saw in some cases there were step increases, in some cases there were adjustments in scale. But at the end of the day, it's a percentage in terms of what teacher compensation is. And so we are affirmatively not trying to overtake Arlington. We're trying to be competitive. Since Arlington this time has chosen to give a step rather than an COLA, that helps us get the scale closer. But the overall level of teacher compensation is still going up 3%, whether you give it in, or if what is the amount of a step if we gave a step?
It's about 3%.
About 3%. We decided as a board, and this I can say, it's not my personal opinion, it's the board's decision, that in this case we wanted to do a COLA as opposed to a step because we thought it was fairer across the board in terms of giving all of our personnel an additional step. This puts us in a better position for the future because we've got a scale that's already closer to Arlington. But this doesn't say anything about we're changing the priority to be within 1% of Arlington or equal to Arlington or over Arlington. It just says we need to give our teachers and our entire body of personnel fair compensation so that we can be competitive. And that requirement, at least from my personal perspective, is never going to go away. Teachers, there are reasons a teacher might decide to be in Fairfax County because it's a smaller commute, all of those sorts of things. When picking between Falls Church and Arlington, there are fewer differences. They've got small class sizes. They've got a highly educated and diverse population. We compete with Arlington very directly, and we've got to maintain a degree of competitiveness if we're going to get the teachers that we want in the school system. So I think that's responsive to your question. On the question about putting the superintendent and the city manager in a room to discuss this, since we complained before that the city council might have been intruding into our responsibilities, I would say that the tax rate is your responsibility, and so I would defer to you.
Well, I appreciate it. I bear that responsibility. That was why I decided not to ever run for the school board, because I saw that the needs were great enough that it seemed to be my highest and best use would be to try to generate new revenue for the city through economic revitalization so that we'd have more money to argue about. And happily, we do have that now. I mean, that is another good story about this budget that kind of gets lost in the, sparring. I did look up the word budget guidance in Nick's online newspaper last week and was pleased to see at least 10 or 12 years of clips of school boards and city councils sparring over budget guidance. So, we may think we're special, but there's nothing new under the sun here. What you said about steps and COLAs, so I don't want to get into your business to that degree. That's not my personal area of expertise. But, I would, encourage you to, do whatever it is you can do that would try to set us up to be able to be within reasonable competitive range of Arlington. If stepping does it, do stepping. If COLA does it, do COLAs. I mean, even, I understand there's some complications if you get rid of a step system. Once teachers get up at the top, they don't know where else to go, and maybe there's ways to address that, but I'd take it at your word that, what the approach that you've chosen, COLAs, is not just good for this year, but it's good for the long term, because I think it's what we need to look at. And also, I would like to know the information on their class sizes, because that is important. And the challenge that I think you acknowledged and we all see is that we're never going to get good data on why a very few number of people leave our school system. Just not that many people leaving our school system. You have more than 500 employees, right? I mean, a bad year is when you lose 20 people. And so being able to hang our decisions on that kind of metric isn't going to be of any much help. We basically have to make a values decision that, we want to pay our teachers here in Falls Church within, pick your number, 4 or 5% of what they get paid in Arlington on some, scale that you can communicate to the public. And you do have to be able to communicate to the public. The message that's coming out of this budget is we want to get within 1% of Arlington's teachers. And we can't do that. I agree with Ms. Hardy. In the long run, we just can't accomplish that, I don't think. Not unless we build 30-story buildings on the east and west end of town and generate that kind of revenue. All right, well, that'll do for me for right now for the first round. Thanks.
Mr. Mayor, real quick.
Yeah.
And I would just say that that's never really has been our goal. The only reason that we're getting to where we are now is because Arlington's only doing one or the other, because there are points where they could have potentially done both, and we would still be probably in that 4 to 5 range that we've been talking about. But because they only chose to do a step this year is why we have hit that so close this year. But who knows what they're going to do next year. And I will tell you, the superintendent and probably even the staff, they're looking at it and would love to get both COLA and the step increase. But ultimately, we know with all the capital projects that are going right now that we have to make a choice. And we've expressed to them that we're at a point that we have to make those choices to make sure that we're doing our part to recognize that we are for the next few years, we're going to be in a tight situation with both the capital projects going on, but also we can't necessarily, in the same window of time, let the overall quality of what we're doing within our schools suffer because.
Thank you for that. May I just ask one additional question? Thank you. Yeah, I know. I hear you. I get the special treatment from the mayor. The national standards that you're trying to meet on school psychologists, it's the first time I've ever heard of that. Okay, I'm not on the school board. I don't do this for a living. I've been through 6 budgets now, and it's the first time I've heard that we're like way short on school psychologists. Who knew? Sadly, there have been, school shooting tragedies during my entire adult lifetime. So I get it that it is a, pressing societal need right here and right now. And, I would lock them, the room in which I lock them, I would have them come out with a psychologist as well as a, 2% growth. But what I want to know going forward is what other national standards are we not meeting here in Falls Church that are going to necessitate us hiring positions that we do not now foresee? Because I got to feel that in a system as small as ours, we don't have as many as the National Association of window shade pullers says we should have for the number of students we have. So I'd ask you as part of this year's budget to look ahead to, are we, school bus drivers? I don't know. Athletic coaches, school resource officers. Are there things out there that we have no idea about now that we need to start building into our cost model?
Well, I can't answer your question about things we don't know about already, but what I can say is that we have identified that we are short on school social workers as well. But we're good with school counselors. Our teaching, our PTR, our pupil-teacher ratio looks pretty good. Again, we're have higher class sizes than Arlington currently in elementary, middle, and high. So we're working hard to take care of some of those issues.
Let me
One
just have a
additional- sorry,
quick comment to that, which is that I thank you for that question, but I, for one, am reluctant to open the box called Pandora. I would just as soon not know about these things if we don't have to.
Wise words indeed.
I also wanted to offer one additional piece of data to Mr. Duncan, which is we have a set of planning factors that decide what level of resourcing we need based on what our student population is. So those are planning factors that we use every year to try and determine how many personnel we need. We, with the arrival of Dr. Noonan, are working to make those planning factors even more rigorous. And one of the things that I think we've talked about is doing some additional work to compare those planning factors against other jurisdictions to see that our personnel allocations are all, if they're different from another school that we know, or another jurisdiction, we know why they're different. But the goal is not to be, it's to be the absolute reverse of arbitrary with regard to personnel allocations, but to have a consistent approach that'll drive what we do every year, recognizing that in some years, budget realities may not allow us to meet those planning factors, but then we'll try to get back to what the amount is in a future year. So it's actually a fairly rigorous approach to deciding how many people we ought to need. And I suspect, I will just share my personal view for a moment, which is for a long time, we as a school system strongly emphasized class size. And that led to too small a set of support apparatuses, to the extent that, we fought last year to get a couple of additional custodians because although our school population had grown, we hadn't added a custodian in like 10 years. So we're, I think, working to add things like custodians and all of those other support pieces to the process that we use. If you look at the Wehby Guide, I have not looked at the most recent one, but you will be surprised at the low amount of administrative personnel in a small school system like Falls Church compared to bigger school systems. We have an incredibly thin administrative apparatus compared to a place like Fairfax County, where there ought to be economies of scale that would have them allow them to have a much thinner administrative apparatus. So we are continuing to be very rigorous and to work on making sure that we've got the right allocations of administrative, classroom, and support personnel across the school system.
All right, I've just got one or two brief questions, if we can. Mr. Lichtenhouse, go ahead. No, go ahead, sure.
Saving the tough questions for last. I was able to thank you, Mr. Shields and Ms. Bobwell, for forwarding the link to the Wehby report. I found that incredibly useful. Reading through all of the profiles of the various jurisdictions, there is some really good data in here. I look at this discussion, and I have to just flat out tell you, I hate the comparison against Arlington on a regular basis. We seem so hyper-focused on that. For somebody with young kids, it drives me nuts. If I thought Arlington was a better school district or a better place to live, I think there's many of us that have moved into the city that moved there, but we don't feel that way. There's a lot of ways to compare school systems, and I look at the profile of these jurisdictions that have been included in the Wehby report, and there's a lot of places where we are doing much better than Arlington. The SAT scores. When you look at the IB program, when you look at our graduation rate, when you look at the number of kids participating in standardized scores, we are outshining Arlington at every turn. It's also important to note, you can consider this a philosophical comment, that the way that we run our school system, how effective we are, and how successful we are is more than just teacher pay. It's more than just the standardized test scores. It's how happy the kids are, how happy the teachers are, the retention rate. There are a lot of moving pieces here, and there's a tendency, both here and outside of city discussions and school board discussions, to focus on data and drill so far down in data that we lose sight of, I think, the bigger picture. And that is that we've got a fantastic school district here. And I would consider us on par, if not better, in a lot of ways than Arlington, and I think that that's important to note. One thing that I would ask, as it relates to this, and this is just a general question, I guess, for Dr. Noonan, is that, there may come a time over the next 3 years where, we don't have revenues coming into the city that provide enough for us to satisfy all of our operating needs. And I will tell you that will be acutely focused on more than likely debt related to the school project. And I would ask if we've done enough planning, both this year and in preparation of the next 2 years, if there's a downturn in the economy, where we don't have to make some very difficult decisions around where that money's going to come from, because you can only restructure, reallocate, reorganize, and reposition people to make up for that. And it's going to be a very tough discussion to have when that downturn takes place, when we just say there is not enough money available. There just isn't. And so I like to think 2, 3, 4, 5 years down the road to say, have we been planning well enough to mitigate a downturn, to make sure that we don't have to sacrifice some of the things that do pour directly into the data that tell us that we are doing a better job than Arlington.
Mr. Lichtenhouse, thank you. I think there's a couple of things to remember in the school budget. And the first is that 85% is salary and benefits of the people that work here, and that includes teachers. And of that 85%, the majority of it are in our buildings. And we hire based on the number of students that we have. So in 3 to 4 years, if something happens with the economy, but our student population grows by 150 kids, we've now got 150 kids that we now need to serve. So we are either going to serve those kids with the teachers we have and increase class size, or we're going to have to hire more teachers to serve those 150 kids. So it's a hard question to answer, not knowing, because for us to set ourselves up for some sort of downturn in the economy would suggest that we start squirreling money away so that we can hire teachers later. And we don't have money to squirrel away. We're spending all we've got. So I think the shortest answer that I can give you, based on that long answer I just gave you, would be as long as students stop coming, we'll be in good shape.
I think that's the chicken and egg problem, is that the better your school district is, the more kids are going to want to go to school here, and parents are going to want to bring their kids in here. So I know it is a virtually impossible question to ask, and maybe it's more rhetorical, but I'm optimistic about Falls Church, and I try to remain eternally optimistic about many things in life, but I do think that we'll be facing some difficult challenges over the next 3 to 4 years that we'll have to make some very difficult decisions. I would say just a couple other things related to this WABE report. One thing that I did find interesting, and again, I don't want to get into comparisons. Maybe that's a phobia I have, as being a middle child. I'm tired of being compared to siblings. But I did notice in the Arlington Public School profile that they had, there was the last bullet point on page 6. It talks about improved academic performance increases local property values by $2.7 to $4.7 billion, resulting in added property tax revenue of $27 to $47 million annually. I don't know where that statistic came from. I don't know how it was derived, if it's accurate or it's not. I have always found that to be an interesting part of the discussion, and I think Mr. Duncan was getting to this in terms of the context of other decisions we have to make around commercial development, economic development, what it means in terms of revenue. But I think it is important for these types of discussions for folks to keep that in mind. People talk about it, right? It's why our homes cost so much. People want to move here. It's a supply-demand fundamental. A lot of that's driven by the schools. But I would be interested, not that you guys need to undertake that analysis right now or anybody has time for that, but I thought that was a very interesting statistic. And if that was something that we could quantify, I certainly would be interested to know what that is.
We think that there was a study done by the National Realtors Association, and we can see if it has jurisdictional data specific to our system. I don't know if they do or not, but we can certainly look into that. What I will say, though, is that national data suggests what you just said, and that is that great schools increase property values. That's why companies move to communities. That's why businesses, start their companies there. And if you look at the short list, for Amazon, for example, you don't see them shortlisting communities that have bad schools.
Right. Well, again, that's the complexity of that issue as well, because then it creates affordability issues in the city. So there's a constant balance and discussion. So I'm not saying it's an easy answer or issue to tackle altogether. Two final things. One, I know there was some discussion. I've certainly spoken with some of you individually as part of this budgeting process has unfolded, and I know there have been some comments from the public recently about And I know that this is also something that has been discussed in the past, but I am certainly one that advocates at least a full-throated discussion over some type of modified rev share. And I think that it creates its own sets of problems, but it also eliminates some of what I'll consider the browbeating or animosity or conflict associated with that. Maybe it's a modified rev share because the school board does not control the tax rate, just like we don't control exactly where you guys spend the money, that maybe there is some consideration for large capital projects or things that are unforeseen in terms of how that's handled. Again, complicated question, complicated thing to tackle, but I certainly, as someone that's new to this budget process and hopefully providing a fresh perspective that's appreciated, maybe not, see, that we have that discussion after this is over, because I think that it could certainly change the dynamics and make this a much or a cleaner process. And then the last question I have, and this is the hard-hitting question that'll more than likely end up in the news press. I was looking in the Waby report, and one thing that stuck out to me was, and this is no laughing matter, I was seriously hoping for an answer for this, why our breakfasts cost so much more per pupil than surrounding jurisdictions? So that's on page 42 of the Waby report. It was just one number that stuck out.
So
That's a high school, middle school issue.
Yeah, and I can also tell you, based on my experience, the quality of the breakfast served in Falls Church is like another league from the breakfast food that I've seen served, certainly in where I came from in Fairfax, and no offense to my former Fairfax employers. You know, when you look at the food that's being served, right, I was at the high school and they had scrambled eggs and oatmeal and fruit, and it's not any type of just prepackaged milk, you know, and a breakfast item that's prepackaged and wrapped and bought off the shelf, right? I'm assuming that's some of it. The other thing that I would say is when you look at Fairfax, for example, they're getting pretty significant subsidies in terms of breakfast. So the First Lady of Virginia has had a huge push to get breakfast fed to all of their students. That's something that Fairfax had lagged in before. And she had really worked to get additional state funding to fund that initiative, and they're benefiting a lot from that, and that's really helping in terms of funding that meal.
So these probably aren't apples to apples comparisons, what you're saying, and we have free-range eggs where everybody else has the dehydrated. The powdered
I would
stuff.
say subsidy-wise, they're not apples to apples.
Okay. I don't know how much we spend on breakfast, and I know that some of our students buy, correct?
Yes.
At least my daughter did, yeah. Okay. All right.
If you'd like to craft a budget question, you know.
I'm
certainly-
sure it's not a significant line item. It was more just interested. I mean, our breakfast price is like $2.50 across the board, where some are like $1.65, $1.75. Again, this is not,
We
this
also
doesn't need to hold us up.
Those are also
but-
self-supporting programs at the high school and middle school. And the reason that they're self-supporting was the quality of food that we were able to prepare by taking subsidies, federal subsidies, didn't meet the standard of the community. Elementaries were able to do that. We do have many more students that are on free and reduced lunch at the elementary, so we do take the subsidy. So I think that they're also covering costs associated with that.
Got it. Okay. Thank you.
Just one comment. The revenue sharing thing brought up something that I was going to raise is I certainly would advocate for us kind of exploring it. So maybe we can actually just put it on the agenda for maybe like a May, June budget and finance meeting. The one thing I will caution though, I don't think it is a silver bullet, right? Because it is agnostic to your enrollment growth. So the devil's going to be in the details. Are we going to do a 52-48 split? Is it a 50-50 split? You know, whatever the numbers will be, that is going to require lots of consternation. And again, the fact that it's going to be agnostic to enrollment growth. I think since we talked so much about Arlington, I actually sat with Arlington County Board Chair, and they have a $20 million revenue shortfall this year, and it's because of capital issues, but also frankly that they have commercial vacancy rates. So while we aspire to have more commercial, they have so much commercial that's vacant, and it's dragged down their assessed values. And so they don't have enough money. And what the chair said is, well, because we do revenue sharing with Arlington, in Arlington, we're splitting that revenue shortfall. They get 10 million, we get 10 million. And so despite having increased enrollment in APS, they had to find a way to plug 10 million. That's why they're raising class sizes. I think they call it changes in planning factors. So while I think it merits certainly more discussion, because I certainly don't want to spend more time going into details like this, and I think we all would love to have a couple more months of our life back, I think it is really important to get into the details of how could it work, because I do think, you know, it is worth the discussion, but I do want to make sure people understand that detail is really important. It's going to be agnostic to enrollment growth, and it's going to be in good times and in bad. So I want to make sure people understand that, because I don't think we're going to see 7.6% revenue growth that we saw this year, or we're expecting this year. That's frankly not going to be sustainable for us.
Just one quick note. The school board had actually put on its work items for the future to discuss the parameters that we'd want to see in a revenue sharing agreement, because we're not by any means against it. But I don't, it's not necessarily clear to me that a revenue sharing agreement that was agnostic about class, or about the number of students would be possible. I would think it would need to take into account the growth of the student population compared to the growth of the city population, which is one of the reasons why it's complicated. So to the extent you assume that any revenue sharing agreement would need to be agnostic about growth in the number of students, I would disagree with that.
Okay, other comments or questions? I've got just one or two quick questions. I know it's getting a little bit late. One is about, we spent a lot of time talking about Arlington and our pay ranges relates to Arlington. Can you sort of take us down the other side of the ladder? Kind of how do we rate with everyone else? Are we number 2 then in Northern Virginia as far as teacher salary goes?
I'd have to go back and look at the overall list. Can't say that for sure. We can get that as a budget question, though.
Because it seems like we're always comparing ourselves to Arlington. We're striving to be as close to Arlington as we can be. I presume that's because Arlington is the top pay, but I'm not sure I'd ever heard that.
Yeah, we'd have to look. I know that Alexandria is pretty high as well, but we can go back and check.
It'd be interesting just to sort of see kind of how we fit in the region, not just comparison to Arlington, but actually into other school districts that surround us or that are nearby. My second and last question relates to something was discussed a week or two ago, which is walk range for buses and the like. And I guess that somewhat goes to the budget in terms of costs for school buses and gasoline and drivers and the like. But I'm wondering what is our walk range and how does it compare to some of our neighbors, for example, Arlington and Fairfax County?
Yeah, our current walk range is a mile, 1.5 mile. Well, I'll let you answer that question.
So the allowable walk range when we look at like high school students is 1.5 miles. We currently are busing students that live closer to that, and in large part it's impacted by student safety. So for example, when we look at students needing to cross Broad Street or Route 7, but we certainly have an operational report we just did looking at transportation. We have the current ranges so that we have students walk. We can get that for you.
I guess what I'd be most interested in is at what range we provide a bus and how does that compare to other localities? In other words, if you live within, if you're a touch over a half mile, you get a bus ride, whereas Arlington might be a mile or somewhere else. I guess to me that's an interesting comparison. It goes beyond budgetary factors, but goes to health, environment, and a lot of other things that I think are kind of core community values here.
And I don't know what Arlington's ratios are off the top of my head. I know Fairfax is at the maximum that's allowed by the state, right? So Fairfax is busing only students that they're required to because they're at that maximum distance or greater.
What is that distance?
Except when there's a hazard. So for high school students, I believe it's 1.5 miles. Right, for
Okay.
elementary students in Fairfax, they do what's called depot busing. So elementary students need to walk to a set point, and they're picked up from that set point. So they also can have elementary students walk quite a distance as well before the bus picks them up.
And what is our bus range? In other words, if you live a half mile out, do you get a bus ride if you want one?
So I'm not exactly sure what the range is for Falls Church, but I'll get that for you. I know one of the factors that we look at a lot is hazards and what intersections we're having students cross and what that balance is in terms of busing or needing additional crossing guard support. But I can get you the exact range.
I think if you also consider certain intersections to be unsafe, I think we would like to know as a city council as well. I mean, we would like to provide safe intersections for all members of our community to get throughout our town or city. So if you do feel there's intersections you think our kids cannot safely cross, I think we'd all like to hear that.
Okay.
Sure, real quick.
Yeah, real quick. Well, the two of you here together. So the talk on the street is that you guys got together and agreed that you would treat your employees about the same in your compensation presentations to your respective bodies, which is, I think, a commendable and something that we always ought to do. I think we all agree that everybody works hard for the city, schools and city side. And then you went your separate ways. And the city budget comes in at under 2%. The school's budget does not come in at, it comes in where it comes in. puts pressure on us because, you know, we don't have a whole lot of place to go either except, you know, the people. It's not as big as yours, but it's still a number. How do you suggest that we deal with that?
I think one way is by asking the questions that you're asking. I think those are really good questions. You know, when we have 85% of our staff, of our budget is in people, the cost for us to do a cost of living allowance is going to be significantly greater than it is on the general government side when you have many fewer employees. If you were to do a proportionality of staff and percentage, you would see that disparity. So, for example, for us to do a 1% cost of living, it's about $365,000. And what would it cost you to do a 1% cost of living?
About 160,000 is what Ms. Bawa says.
So for us, you know, to do equivalency of percentages, it's significantly greater for the schools because we have many, many more employees. So it costs more to operate the schools because of the percentage of staff that are there.
Okay. Unless there's any other questions or comments, I would like to thank you all for coming out this evening. We do have more to go. I don't know if the rest of it, the tax rate necessarily is directed at our school board colleagues. You're certainly welcome to stick around for the rest of the meeting. I think this is the portion that was meant to kind of Q&A as to your budget. We're going to move on to the tax rate and the CIP ordinance.
I thought Mr. Shields was going to present on the.
We have, Ms. Bawa has, we've prepared responses to questions that we received, and so we'd like to walk through those. We also have an update on WMATA and on the amount of, you know, on what we're planning to issue debt for in the coming year. Those are the kind of the new things that we'd like to discuss tonight, and then any questions on the actual ordinances themselves.
So any of the members of the school board, you're welcome to stick around to the rest of the discussion. I think the main portion was to have this Q&A about your budget, and we're really happy that you came out and you had some great responses, so we appreciate that. You're, again, welcome to stick around for the rest of the meeting, but thank you very much.